What do a game show, an auction, a fashion show, a museum, over $80,000 in prize money, 400 quilts, and thousands of quilt enthusiasts have in common? The largest and most prestigious celebration of the quilt maker's art and craft. From JR's Executive Inn in Paducah, Kentucky, Quilt City, USA, it's the 1995 American Quilter Society National Quilt Show and Contest.
This is gorgeous, and this is something I strive to do.
But that's beautiful.
This is the first time I've ever been, and I think it's great.
Absolutely the greatest show on earth.
What are these quilters talking about?
It's great. I think
Why, the quilts, of course. The theme of the 1995 show was seasons. And from the cool blues of winter to the vibrant hues of spring, the quilts on display were awash in color.
she did an excellent job on it. It's gorgeous.
Well, it's lovely. Absolutely lovely. This is the best of show, is it?
It's beautiful.
Fiber reactive dye to create feeling of flight. Machine freehand quilted. It does. It just moves. It's great.
The 1995 Best of Show and $15,000 prize winner was Carol Breyer-Fallert of Oswego, Illinois, for her quilt, Migration Number 2. Carol is no stranger to the AQS's highest honor, having previously been a Best of Show winner.
And I was so surprised. I never thought I'd win it twice. This quilt is called Migration 2. I've been doing a series of quilts for a number of years about things that happen in the sky and about birds. And so this is about what I think it would feel like to be a bird with a group of migrating birds flying over the landscape. And to me, flying kind of symbolizes the ultimate feeling of freedom. I think if I were up there with those birds flying, it would just give me this very wonderful feeling of freedom. And so that's what the quilt is about. They're birds of the imagination. They're not any particular species of bird. And so everyone sees a different kind of bird in them depending on their personal experience. And I like that. Well, I love color, and I've worked with it a lot. And the fabric in my quilts, the Corona quilt and this, are dyed by me so that I can get the colors that I want to express the idea that I have in my head. And so the fabric in this quilt, other than the black fabric, which is commercial, all started out as white cotton fabric. And I painted every bit of the fabric with fiber reactive dyes in the colors I love. And then I use that fabric and cut it up and use templates just like you would any other quilting fabric. But in order to get the colors that express the vision I have in my head, I paint and dye it all myself. And I mean, when I say paint, I'm painting dye on the fabric. Well, it took me a month to complete the piecing and quilting and 15 years of practice working up to that. I mainly just quilt. I'm not a very well-balanced person. I'm not very domestic, and I don't shop very much. And I spend all of my time at home pretty much in my studio making quilts.
Do you use metallic threads? I'm not
All of the threads in this quilt are cotton, but I've switched to a number 30 top stitching thread, which is a thicker thread and really shows up, and I change colors really often. So the feathered plumes, for instance, a lot of people have thought were variegated thread, and I do use variegated thread sometimes, but this actually, I change thread colors every 5 plumes. So it looks like variegated thread, but I actually threaded and unthreaded my machine that many times. It was kind of the fussy part of it.
Deja vu struck again in 1995 as Deborah Wagner of Cosmos, Minnesota won her second Bernina Award for machine workmanship and $10,000 prize money with her quilt entitled Sunburst Quilt.
Well, this is all machine made. In fact, this quilt is unique in that, of course it's machine pieced, but the machine quilting, even the parallel lines of stitching are all done free machine, free motion, which is most of the time straight lines or circular lines are done with a walking foot on, and mine was not. It's all done with the darning foot. Everything's darning foot. So. Well, this one's been trapuntoed in the feather designs, and that was part of the original was also trapuntoed, and it's done in a traditional manner in which it's the backing, the woof and weft in the backing is split, and it's trapuntoed from behind after the quilt is quilted. So it was one of the last things to do. The binding was the very end. The back of the quilt surprisingly looks a lot like the front, except there's no piecing on it. But the way it's trapuntoed, you cannot really tell the back from the front. And so when you look at it, this side happens to be chintz, and the other side happens to be just plain off-white cotton, but they look amazingly alike. So it took exactly 3 months, that's 8 hours a day, for 6 days a week.
One of the most coveted awards at the AQS show is the Ginger Award for hand workmanship. 1995's Ginger Award and $10,000 prize winner was Carol Steiner of Santa Maria, California, for Lilies Are Forever.
Well, I had made it for in honor of my husband and my 20th anniversary, and so I was going to use it, you know, on the bed. Yeah, because I make quilts for myself. I don't make quilts for a show. I never have, and so if there happens to be a show that I want to put it in, then I'll send it to a show. It's the Carolina Lily block is one of my favorite blocks, and I know a lot of the traditional quilt blocks, which I love to do, they kind of lose their romance or appeal over time, but I think that lilies are forever, and that's kind of how the name came about. Well, I wanted a lot of white in this quilt because it left a lot of places open for me to do my hand quilting, which I really love to do. So that's why I designed it purposely with a lot of white areas. There's 1,500 hours of hand quilting in it.
Quilts are meant to be seen, and a number of quilt makers take that sentiment to its logical end by creating wearable works of art. The AQS Fashion Show, like a sultry summer day, one of the hottest and most sought-after tickets at the show, delighted the audience with stunning examples of creativity and craftsmanship.
with the Best of Show Award, and that goes to Jacqueline Nouveau, number 30.
I hate to have old fabrics or furs or things not be used, just to go to waste, and I decided to give this piece of fur coat a second chance. How did I put it together? With great difficulty and many broken needles on the sewing machine. I made a muslin form and a paper form, and then I drew a design out on it that I felt was pleasing, and then I started laying my furs and my fabrics out on it, and then trying to get them to adhere to the fabric or the muslin undergarment by stitching them down and then covering each of the places rather than overlap or make seams. They just butted up next to each other, and then I laid the bias, the cotton bias, over the top of it to give it a finished look all the way around.
The garment was prompted out of an emotional experience that I had. It was kind of a sad experience, and it inspired me to take my sorrow out in my garment, and therefore I sewed all the black hearts on it because it was very sad, and it's a very confusing time and a meandering path. It's mostly done by machine. There's well over 1,000 hearts on the top of the garment, on the inside. The vest I made has been put together, and it covers my broken heart. And it was a very emotional garment for me to do, but a very healing time. And I have found that the sewing has been very beneficial for me to do that with.
As show attendees entered the Executive Inn, they were greeted by the Magic Carpet Challenge. Something new for '95 was the Fabric Postcards Contest. While one would never entrust these to the U.S. Postal Service, they are a different creative outlet for quilters.
It was the Super Bowl of quilting. It really is.
And they came last year hoping to drop me and another lady off. They have gotten more caught up in the quilts and what they're about, my husband, this gentleman, and my pastor,
Well, if the
than
fellas
I
are watching,
know.
we're still watch football.
But they do know more about quilts, what they're about and what have you now. So that's actually good. They support me. He's the photographer. I have my pastor, the driver, and he's my supporter.
No, we're really amazed at these, though. It's amazing to me how people can keep a perspective while they're sewing to get some of these designs out. It's amazing.
It's taking extreme patience.
I
I
can't
thought I
imagine
had
someone
it
sitting down doing
being
it.
an avid fisherman, but I couldn't hang with them. I'd probably go nuts.
Besides, my home's going to start looking like this. It already has. Be thankful? Oh, okay. I'm thankful.
This is great.
The AQS is dedicated to honoring today's quilters, and so the annual awards banquet is always an eagerly anticipated event. It is here that the quilt makers and their quilts receive the honor they so richly deserve, and over $80,000 in prize money is handed out.
My quilt, Woman in a Box, was designed while I was awaiting surgery for, I was told I had breast cancer and very thankfully did not. But I had to wait a few hours in a very small room, alone, and so they gave me a piece of paper and a pen to entertain myself. So I sat there and designed quilts, because quilts always brought me comfort. So after the surgery, and I found I was fine and was thankful, I then built the quilt Woman in a Box, and she's done in very cool colors because it was cold, so she's in blues and greens. And the entire quilt is quilted in lizards that would show like fear that runs up someone's back. And her hands are in just bones to show the skeletal structure to reflect vulnerability.
Well, after all of the judging is done, each judge chooses one special quilt that was not a previous prize winner to give their own special award to. And Anita Shackelford was the judge who chose my quilt, which I'm very honored. My quilt is called Scrap Apple, which is a combination name, Scrap Quilt, SKRAP/APLE, and that derives from the pineapple pattern, which is the central medallion, and there are also love apples appliqued and quilted into the edge border. So the name arrived from that combination. It's a piece block. There's 4,440 pieces in the center part, the pineapple part, and then it has an original applique design in the border.
First place in professional traditional piece is Solstice by Barbara Barber of Weyhill, Andover, England. Barbara explains that this quilt's design is an original adaptation of the New York beauty pattern. Barbara started to make her quilt on the winter solstice and challenged herself to complete it by the summer solstice. First place in Innovative Piece Amateur is Gridlock by Martha E. Brooks of Wayland, Massachusetts. This quilt, featuring the New York City skyline superimposed on a grid, adapted from an optical illusion found in a graphics book, was made as a wedding gift. In my mind's eye, this is what they see from the windows of their apartment. First place in Professional Innovative Piece is Dreamcatcher by Becky Brown of Richmond, Virginia. Anticipating a 2-week vacation trip to Kansas, Becky decided to cut out the pieces for sunflower blocks before leaving home. This quilt was the result. First place in Applique Amateur is Nebraska Sunflower by Patricia L. Styring of St. Augustine, Florida. The center circle is composed of 6 different background fabrics, and its sunflowers feature 3-dimensional petals of golden fabric. The leaves on the border are cut from printed fabric and appliqued to form a frame for the quilt. First place in professional applique is My Garden by Jane Hullahan of Walworth, New York. This garden scene features a diamond medallion setting with winding feather quilting motifs placed on the points of the center darker green band. To increase the illusion of a garden, Jane has added appliqued birds in 2 corner areas. First place in Other Techniques, Amateur and Professional, is Peruvian Primitive by Hallie H. O'Kelly of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. This quilt was inspired by primitive art of the Incas, including weavings, carvings, and paintings. The central figure in the medallion was screen printed over a strip-pieced, tie-dyed background. Hallie is the author of the 1995 book, Screen Printing for Quilters. First place in the group quilt, Amateur and Professional, is A Charleston Basket by Cobblestone Quilters Guild of Charleston, South Carolina. From 50 to 75 people worked on this quilt, with co-chairs Ruth McIver and Marcia Pauling doing much of the work and coordinating the efforts. The Guild reports that working on the quilt brought them all together. First place in Traditional Pieced Amateur is Eric's Crown by Beverly Hines Cosby of Mechanicsville, Virginia. Scraps, the 8-pointed star block, and the creation of a circular effect using straight lines are Beverly's favorite quilt elements. This is the 4th time Beverly has been a prize winner at AQS shows. First place in Wall Quilt Amateur is Paradise by Teresa McPeak of Montrose, Colorado. This quilt was inspired by a beautiful piece of fabric she had found in a sale bin and kept for years. For Teresa, the quilt represents paradise, with the beautiful flowers in the center protected by the spikes of the border. First place in professional wall quilt is Tree of Life, Spring, by Jane A. Sassaman of Chicago, Illinois. She comments, "This quilt illustrates the power and hope inherent in new life. It took a lot out of me while it was being made, but it has been repaying me by collecting energy whenever it is seen by others." First place in the pictorial wall quilt Amateur Professional is Pigeon Point and Sandpipers by Vicki Johnson of Soquel, California. Vicki decided to feature a favorite lighthouse south of San Francisco as it was before 1960 in this piece commissioned specially for a round room similar to a lighthouse. Because the owners had several Oriental pieces in the room, Vicki chose to use Oriental perspective. Best wall quilt is Hot Fun by Melody Johnson of Cary, Illinois. An intense white and hot yellow piece of hand-dyed fabric said "Sun" to Melody. From that, she easily designed the summer sun with its concentric circles, rays, and sunspots. Melody uses fusible web liberally to heat press pieces, which are then firmly attached to the quilt with machine quilting. The viewer's choice wall quilt is Prairie Dreamer by Dawn Amos of Rapid City, South Dakota. In this Native American-themed pictorial quilt, Dawn Amos continues to experiment with creating faces in fabric. Using features from 5 or 6 photos of different faces, she draws each unique face and then works with various hand-dyed fabrics to translate this drawing into fabric. The viewer's choice quilt is The Bride by Linda M. Poole of Vienna, Virginia. She originally planned to create the entire quilt in squares, but some quick addition convinced her to create only the bride in squares, 16,243 squares, and then applique the 944 pieces to a solid background.
This is from a photograph I took coming back from skiing at Taos, New Mexico. This was the river running alongside the road, and I photographed it and then drew it and made a quilt out of it. When I originally was doing the drawing, it was all going to be in the whites and the blues, but I ended up adding color in these weaves through it so that I could play with more color variations, and I really liked what the color did for it. The quilt that's upstairs is of a redwood forest, and I was born in Northern California, and I have 7 brothers and sisters, and we used to camp underneath the trees. And I went back there last summer and photographed it and wanted to interpret the feelings that I had as a child with my family camping in the redwoods.
A new competition category at the 1995 show was miniature quilts. Despite their small size, they generated big excitement. Competition chairman Claudine Hansen explains.
We have a lot of people who've been interested in miniature quilts for a few years. It seems to be a pretty popular subject. You know, the idea of making a king-size quilt is so overwhelming that a lot of quilt makers think, I'll never get it done. So lots of times they do like to work in the miniature quilts. And we had a lot of entries to pick from this year.
Try to solve prairie point.
The AQS show is more than the serious business of objectively judging quilts. It's also a time of fellowship and fun. And nowhere was that more true than at the AQS Game Show, a new event for 1995. A trip to Quilt City, USA for the AQS show isn't complete without a visit to the magnificent Museum of the American Quilter Society. Open year-round, MAQS houses 3 galleries with various exhibits throughout the 4 seasons, as well as a gift shop and bookshop. Classes and seminars are held at the museum both during the show and the rest of the year. 1995 show attracted record crowds, and plans for 1996 began almost as soon as the 95 show ended. So get your needles, thread, and fabric together and let your creative juices flow. You too could have a place in quilting history.
For more information about the AQS, write to the American Quilters Society, Post Office Box 3290, Paducah, Kentucky, 42002-3290.